Hello, good evening. Thank you for joining us on yet another wet, damp, cold, dark winter's evening. But very appropriate. What we're doing tonight is the winter weather workshop brought to you this evening by Astral Aviation Consulting on behalf of the UK Civil Aviation Authority. I'm Matt Lane. If you haven't met me before, I'm your host this evening, going to be coordinating things. Uh, Delighted to have with us this evening Dr. Simon Keeling and Darren Hardy. If you haven't met me before, I'm a head of training and an active single and multi FI and examiner and a flight instructor course instructor. So I've got a bit of the flying side, but I'm ably supported by two eminent subject matter experts, which I'll say, let them say hello and introduce themselves. Simon, over to you to say hello and introduce yourself.
Well, evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Simon Keeling, otherwise known as a weather anorak. Yep, that's me. I'm founder and managing director of several weather companies, including Weather Consultancy Services, weatherweb.net. But the one that you probably know me for most of all is Weather School. So I run training courses for pilots, and that's from everywhere from pre-PPL right the way through to commercial pilots, basically trying to improve aviation safety when it comes to net and to weather. So yeah, looking forward to this evening. We've got a lot to get through, and hopefully I think you're going to learn a lot from it.
Brilliant. Thanks. Great to have you with us as ever, Simon. And Darren, a new participant. Darren, welcome. Say hello.
Hello, hello everyone. Hope you're all keeping well. Yep, I'm Darren Hardy. Yes, it's great to be involved in this evening's event. I'm delighted to be invited to it. I've worked at a Met Office ever since I left school about 35 years ago now. So yeah, I'm a proper lifer, I guess. I started out as a lowly Met observer at Stansted Airport, and then I moved into various roles in aviation around Met as a Met instructor, and then as an airport Met inspector. Most recently, I've been responsible for the provision of the aviation forecast products and data that I guess you're all familiar with, and which are provided to the whole of the UK's aviation industry on behalf of the CAA. So I'm actually about to be seconded into the CAA, into the CAA's Met Authority team at the end of this month. So yeah, I guess you could say I've been around aviation my whole working life. So yeah, great to be with you this evening.
Darren, thank you. Brilliant to have us joining us. And over the next 90 minutes, we're going to break the workshop down into some easily digestible chunks. We're going to cover a couple of real life case studies, breaking each into the background, the weather, the accident chain, and what could have perhaps been done to prevent it. And, have a think about what would you have done in these cases. Then we're going to move on to some more broader weather threat and error management, which Darren will mention for us. And hopefully you're going to learn some new tips here. I certainly have in the preparation. And then finally, we'll have some chance to do some questions and answers at the end. As we go through tonight, we'd love you to contribute. I can see people saying hello, and we've got a fantastic range of people from all over the UK and some people from overseas as well, which is brilliant to see. If you do get any questions, add them to the Q&A box, which is separate to the chat box, and we can just manage and make sure we try and get through your questions there as well. We also may try and pick them up during the workshop as well, if they're appropriate to the section, just to try and make it flow. And after the workshop tonight, we would love to get you to stay in the loop with events and resources. So please sign up to our mailing list, and you can do this by going to our website, www.astralaviationconsulting.com. And Talifer, who's doing all of the work for us with the tech in the background, has put that link in the chat box as well. Now, you'll also get a link, and if you sign up, you'll get this workshop as a replay on demand on YouTube. And the great thing about that is, as Simon already mentioned, there is some sections that are quite busy, and there's some graphics and some of the discussion, and you might want to reflect on those or look at them again. And the YouTube replay is absolutely the time to do that, and it's very easy to do that with that. To kick us off, I'd just like to find out, those of you with you tonight, what type of aircraft do you mainly fly? Now, this also gives you a chance to test out the poll functionality. just as a reminder, if you're watching live, you'll be able to do the polls. If you're watching on demand, you won't be able to interact, but you'll see the polls, and we'll talk you through the answers on the slide. So you will be able to see it like that. So there's the first poll. What type of aircraft do you mainly fly? So we've got a list there. We know a lot of you may do different types, but which one do you mainly fly there? And the gyrocopter pilots, if there's any with us tonight as well, I think I missed that off on the previous one, so apologies. Hopefully we've rectified that and got the gyrocopter option in there for you tonight as well. So let's have a look at the results. Hopefully people have had a chance to do that. So vast majority single engine piston. We've got some glider, a couple of balloon pilots. Excellent. It's good to see you with us tonight as well. And 2 of the gyrocopter pilots with us as well. Brilliant to have you with us. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do is myself and Darren will just go on mute, and we will let Simon talk about the background to case study 1 and what happened. Over to you, Simon.
Okay then, thanks, Matt. I think before we start this evening, it's really important to recognise that what we're about to show you are some serious incidents that led to the death of those involved. And I don't think we should ever forget that. The purpose of this webinar is not to apportion blame. And out of respect for those involved, we've anonymised the dates the incidents took place and the aircraft registrations. Although even though I think some of the cases are going to be familiar to some of you. AAIB reports are an excellent way to read more about how and why an accident may have occurred, and I'd urge you to look at these reports regularly. They reveal much about how the weather and other factors impact on us as pilots, and are a perfect way to increase our chances of a similar incident occurring. So above all, the AIB reports make us think, and I do a lot of expert witness work involved in aviation incidents, and a lot of what we do, you can see when you look back at the weather that there were some red flags there that perhaps at some point have been ignored. I'm not suggesting that is the case in the cases we're about to look at, but it kind of forms a familiar pattern. So it's important, I think, to remember the seriousness of what we're looking at tonight. Now, before we get into the detail on this section, let's start, as always, with a quick poll. And I've got a question for you. So what about this? Identifying clouds is a real world skill that all pilots should learn for safer flying. But here in the UK, what is the most common type of cloud? Which one do you think it is? Is it cirrus? Is it stratus, cumulonimbus, or stratocumulus? What's the most common type of cloud here in the UK? I'll just give you a couple of moments just to make your choice as to which one you think it is. So is it cirrus, stratus, cumulonimbus, or stratocumulus? Should we have a look at how you've done? Let's have a look at some results. There we go. Interesting. So 38% of you thought it was stratus. Interesting that 20% thought cumulonimbus, 7% cirrus, and 34% think stratocumulus. So a bit of a stratus-stratocumulus battle going on there. The answer actually is stratocumulus. That's the most common cloud here in the UK. So well done if you got that right. Now, stratocumulus is a pancake type cloud. That's how I always describe it. It's quite featureless, and it sits at around 2,000 to 4,000 feet as a base. And I think we've got a picture here of it that we can show you. Usually it's less than a couple of thousand feet deep. This is the picture looking down on the stratocumulus, and generally it indicates stable air. Now, don't confuse stable air with fair weather, because those two don't combine, but it indicates stable air. Go back to your Met books and have a look for more information on that. It only produces light rain, and it suggests usually conditions not changing in the next 3 or 4 hours. But keep watching it, because if it does start to break up, some sort of change in the weather is likely to take place, and it's generally associated with reasonable visibility and decent flying conditions. And if you can get into clouds and recognizing clouds and putting them together with what's good to fly, actually you can be a long way towards making your own forecasts. So well done on that. Okay then, so let's have a look at our first case this evening, which involved a PA-28R200 aircraft, which was on a private flight with both a pilot and a passenger. The plan was to depart from Wellesbourne, just south of Birmingham, to Latuke as part of a group flyout, which involved 6 other aircraft. Kind of an expedition that would be familiar to many of us. The aircraft, except for one, planned to fly a VFR, all on a similar route, with a flight time of about 1 hour and 40 minutes at 5,000 feet. The flight was taking place in early April, and I remember this incident particularly well because on that day I was hosting a weather school, and I and 6 of the pilots on the course had studied the weather really closely and even planned a similar flight as part of the course. Now, Darren's going to be taking a closer look at the weather in a few minutes, but the forecast for the day was for there to be a line of highly convective cloud, so that's cumulus and cumulonimbus clouds, through the channel. Each of the pilots who took part in the flyout stated that they made their own assessments of the weather conditions. The aircraft departed Wellesbourne between about 0750 hours and 0830 hours and proceeded separately. Now, the aircraft we are following was the second in the group to take off at about 0754 hours and overtook the first aircraft near Basingstoke. After some radio calls, the aircraft contacted London Information at 0839 hours and reported that they were at 5,000 feet. The occupants were taking pictures and video during the flight, and so these gave us a reference for what the pilots were actually seeing out of the window. Now, on the photographs, cumulus cloud can be seen in the distance as they head towards France. And these are some of those photographs. You can see there that cumulonimbus cloud on the right-hand side that's already precipitating. And on the left-hand side, the cloud in front of them shows that line of convective cloud just ahead of the aircraft. So at 0915, the London Information requested the position and altitude of the aircraft, as it was estimated that they'd be approaching the French airspace boundary. It was a few seconds later that the aircraft responded that they are in cloud. Now, after this, London Information attempted to contact the aircraft several times and also asked others to relay messages. No response was received. The flight trace, which is shown in orange on the next slide, shows a rapid climb between around 0910 and 0915 to approximately 7,500 feet, and then an even more rapid descent to around 4,700 feet before, unfortunately, the trace stops. Of the other aircraft, all the pilots reported encountering a line of cumulus cloud in the middle of the channel, and 4 of the 5 VFR aircraft descended below the cloud and found gaps. At 0918 and 0924, the other aircraft took pictures of the cloud with water spouts. Those are tornadoes over the sea below the cloud. So you can see just how convective that weather was. The aircraft was last seen on radar at 0916 hours at a position about 20 nautical miles west of Latuke. On the days following the incident, several items from the aircraft were found on the French coastline, including a bag containing a flying licence, logbook, and documents. So that just introduces us to this case. Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Sets the scene. Obviously, a nice planned day out that very sadly went wrong. So we'll go over to Darren, who's going to give us some information about what actually was happening with the weather on that day. Over to you, Darren.
Okay, thanks. Right, well, let's take a look at some of the forecasts and observations that would have been available before this flight. We'll see if there are any red flags that we can be aware of. So the general weather picture over the area is best illustrated by this synoptic chart. Now, synoptic charts like these, well, they provide the big picture of the weather, if you like. Now, sometimes they can look a bit mystifying, but with a little understanding of these charts, it's quite possible to deduce a significant amount of information about the weather, such as the wind direction, the air mass, and the location of fronts that divide the air masses. Now, this chart is telling us that high pressure is influencing most of the UK, and high pressure typically indicates settled weather. Just across the channel, France is influenced by a low pressure system centred around about southern France. A key feature on this chart is a little line with spikes that you can see just straddling the English Channel. Now, this feature indicates the presence of a convergence line. And convergence lines They're a band of cloud that remain fairly stationary, and they can produce large amounts of showers along that line across a relatively small area. We can also see that isobars indicate the direction and relative strength of the wind. And the isobars across the channel indicate a northeasterly flow. And you can tell this because the wind flows counterclockwise around lows and clockwise around high pressures. Now we'll take a look at some of the forecast information available before the flight. So this chart's a Metform 215. It's a low-level significant weather chart. And put simply, it's a forecaster-produced product in semi-plain language where the UK is split into zones of similar weather. Now this chart was issued at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the image on the left shows the zones assigned by the forecaster, and on the right there's a description of the cloud, the surface visibility, freezing level, and other hazards that are associated within each of those zones. I've highlighted the most relevant parts of the forecast for this flight in yellow on this slide. So in this zone, generally good visibility was forecast, but occasional rain or sleet showers over sea areas were also forecast. In these showers, the surface visibility was expected to reduce to about 5,000 metres. There was also an isolated risk of heavier showers too, potentially with hail and thunder mixed in over the sea and coastal areas. Now, in these heavier showers, the surface visibility was expected to reduce to just 2,000 metres. In terms of cloud, generally up to 4 octaves cover, now that's about half cover of primarily convective cloud, with a base of 2,000 foot was forecast, and that was with associated risks of icing and turbulence. However, there was also an isolated risk of deeper convection in the form of cumulonimbus clouds over coastal and sea areas. And finally, an isolated risk existed for patches of low stratus with a base of about 800 feet. That's probably as a result of any showers that are falling, condensing the air below it. So a showery scene really with potential convective cloud risks associated throughout. And it's worth noting that because this is not a synoptic chart, the convergence line that's seen in the synoptic charts is not displayed. But it's quite clear that the convective hazards are very evident. So let's now take a look at some TAFs around the area at the time. Looking at these TAFs, their content reinforces the potential for showers and strong convective cloud. And you can see highlighted that at times throughout the morning, moderate hail and sleet showers were expected, associated with areas of cumulonimbus. Now, turning to some Met observation data, we'll start with the METARs. Just coming on screen now. Okay, so what are these showing us about the actual weather at the time? Well, this side of the channel, just patchy cloud with a light northerly wind, so not too much to worry about maybe. But across the channel at Latuke, the situation is rather different, with towering cumulus observed. Now, whilst mainly dry currently, there is a trend forecast. Now, trends are 2-hour landing forecasts that are produced for some airports, and they're highlighting that sleet showers and CBs were expected to impact the airport imminently. Now, remember that observations like these are just a snapshot, so they're out of date as soon as they're issued. But nevertheless, they do provide a great deal of information. One other thing to highlight here is that Latuke has produced automated METARs, and they're denoted by the phrase auto within those METARs. Auto METARs are sometimes produced before an aerodrome opens, or if there's no qualified Met observer present. It's worth bearing in mind that there are some limitations with autos, and I'll touch on that later on this evening. We could also take a quick look at what the weather, radar and satellite imagery was showing at the time. So what's immediately apparent is the line of heavy showers that are running along the English Channel from the radar picture. This very much looks like the convergence zone that we saw in the synoptic chart. The line of showers seem to present a barrier to safely crossing the channel. And the bright colours shown by the radar returns indicate that that precipitation is quite heavy. Now, in the far bottom left corner of the satellite image, it's also possible to clearly identify that line of heavy showers running along the channel. And aside from this, there are generally clear skies over the mainland of southern UK. But the bright white of the cloud in the channel, and the lumpy, bumpy structure of that cloud does indicate some strong convective activity. So that's the meteorology associated with this particular flight.
Thank you, Darren. That's brilliant. So what can we do about some threat and error management? Well, let's have a quick look at the accident chain before picking out some learning points. Now, firstly, let me be really clear here in all our case studies. Right, as Simon already mentioned, none of this, the following discussion, is in any way attempted to reopen any formal investigation or imply or make any criticism on the pilot or individuals involved. We're just using the events as a case study to initiate a discussion about the potential factors involved and any mitigations or actions you could perhaps consider if you found yourself experiencing a similar situation. Now, in aviation accidents, we typically review the chain of events or the error chain, and there's going to be many contributing factors leading up to the accident. If just one link in the chain had been broken, so the theory goes, the accident would have been averted. And the contributing actions that make up the links in the chain, we're talking things like human factor related mistakes generally, rather than just simple mechanical failure. Now, it's not to say accidents aren't caused by mechanical failure, but what we're trying to highlight is that it's often our own decision making that plays a significant role in the outcome. So I'm just going to build it here on the slide. These are the things that could have perhaps contributed in the accident chain here. So no instrument qualifications were held by the pilot. Perhaps they misappreciated or misunderstood the weather and its impact on their flight plan. And there might have been some human factors, risky shift or groupthink going on with the fly out. They also selected a route with a danger area below and controlled airspace above versus the likely cloud. And then on encountering the cloud, they attempted to outclimb it, which caused them to inadvertently enter IMC and sadly into a loss of control event as well. You may want to have a think about that on the replay, or think about and reflect that yourselves as well. Is that how the accident built? Could the accident have been trapped and stopped at any one of those stages, or was it a certainty that these were all going to come together in an accident? Perhaps one to think about and reflect on as Simon talks to us about what we could perhaps have done to break the accident chain in this case. Over to you, Simon, to talk about missed opportunities.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Again, I think important when we're looking at this, isn't it, to, again, just emphasising no way are we trying to reopen cases or apportion blame or anything like that. We're just using it as an example to perhaps all learn something from something that's happened to a fellow pilot. So missed opportunities, what can we kind of see from this? I think generally what we're looking for is that we could look at receiving instrument training, the qualifications. So this is kind of get yourself some instrument training, because this can be a lifesaver even if you never intend to use it. Practice it regularly, because it may just get you out of trouble. And if you aren't sure, next time you're at the club, why not ask an instructor to spend some time with you flying on instruments? You can select a route with climb and descent options, and sort of take a look around your route and see what the climb and descent options are. If you're not sure, can you slightly perhaps just tweak your route to incorporate better climb and descent options? Because the more options you have, the more choices you can make and the safer your flight. Perhaps declare urgency or distress to obtain reroute into airspace, because if you need to, you can declare that emergency. You can explain the problem and then leave it to air traffic control to reroute you. Remember that controllers are not to be feared. It's easy to say that, isn't it? But they're not. They're not to be feared. They're there to help us as pilots, to help you. And so telling them what you need and want is absolutely vital. I think this is a good one as well. This is a really important one. Divert before reaching the weather. If the weather ahead looks bad, divert now. Don't fall foul of the, oh, let's take a look, or the get their eye to school of routing. Make a decision to divert and stick to it. There's enough going on in your brain without then questioning your decision. And I experience there's a lot of weather school, the pilots that come to weather school, a lot of them have come because they've had a flight that they're not comfortable with. And very often they've gone through that get airitis. They've come out the other side of it, thank goodness. But it's something I think that all of us can easily fall foul of. We just need to be aware of it. Of course, that 180 turn to return to good known weather conditions. And that should put you back where you were when you were last in those good conditions. It's such a simple technique, isn't it? But it's one that works. Beware to monitor instruments. If you have entered cloud, keep an eye on the angle of the turn, the pitch and the speed. It's easy to lose concentration. And then select a different destination. Keep asking, where can I go? Just because you're close to your destination doesn't mean that you absolutely have to land there, come what may. Choose somewhere else that's got better weather, and don't be afraid to make this decision, even if you're flying with friends. Remember, you're in command, you're in control. It's your decision.
Great, thanks, Simon. And we've just had a couple of comments there as well. John has made a very good point. He said, please remember that many microlights do not have an artificial horizon or instruments, and a lot of permit aircraft and things don't as well. So it's interesting when we look at that opportunities slide there as well. Number 1 and number 5 would effectively be denied to those pilots. Therefore, I guess you could say that the more emphasis on those other mitigations needs to be put in there as well.
Yeah.
And Rachel has commented as well. They were going to Le Touquet, but ended up with Sunday lunch in Lid. So that's about the different destination. Yes, slightly different ends of the spectrum, but I'm sure you had a nice burger or coffee and cake or whatever. And Chris has asked in the Q&A, do we know what actions the other pilots in the group took to avoid the same result? I believe the other aircraft diverted and landed at Shoreham, I think. I'm right in saying, Simon, when we read the case study, I think.
Yeah, and also descended or climbed. They used that descent and climb option as well. And that's what happened to the other aircraft. They actually managed to avoid that.
Yeah, by diverting on the south coast. And
yeah.
Paul has also mentioned, with a filed flight plan, your alternates should already be planned. So yes, at the planning stage, definitely. And I'm just going to pick up another couple of questions because they're very relevant to this case study. So we will do. Andy has asked, do you think the climb to 7,000 feet could have been caused by an updraft? My reading of the study was that it was a deliberate attempt to outclimb it. I don't know what you think. Could we have got an updraft that strong, Simon or Darren? I think more likely to have been a deliberate act, I think. But
yeah, I would. Sorry, Darren, I've kind of jumped in there. I think looking at the trace, I think it was there was part deliberate act in there, but of course you've got to remember that these cumulonimbus clouds have these have massive updrafts and downdrafts associated with them that can easily, in that sort of strength of cloud, take the aircraft. So I think probably, yeah, they climbed, but then it was assisted by the updraft. Of course, we'll never know, but that trace suggests to me that that was assisted in some way. I don't know what you think, Darren.
Oh, I would just agree. I mean, I think the potential for that to exist was certainly present by, well, evidenced by the strong convection. So, but as you say, without knowing the full details, it's hard to speculate really with clarity. But yeah, certainly potentially the case for being uplifted by the thermals.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the big lessons from this case is that, and I see it very often, is that as GA pilots, we sort of take cumulonimbus for granted in a way. You know, you'll see heavy showers pass through the airfield, perhaps giving hail and kind of fly around them. And obviously, thank goodness, 99 times out of 100, we can get away with it. But there are those occasions when these updrafts and downdrafts are so strong and the cumulonimbus is in an early stage of forming, perhaps, that it can cause real severe flight control problems. And I think it's one of those things of not thinking, oh, I got away with it last time, so I'll get away with it this time. And I think that's one of the lessons to learn from this is never underestimate a cumulonimbus or a large cumulus cloud for that. And of course, in the METARs and the TAFs, towering cumulus are reported as TCU, which effectively just think of them as cumulonimbus because they're exactly the same thing. But yeah, for me, that's one of the major lessons from this. Never underestimate the power of a cunim or a large cumulus cloud.
Yeah, and Matthew's asked, was the loss of control caused by airframe icing? Possibly. It's probably more likely to be, you know, disorientation, I think, but icing may have played a part. And if you want to read a really scary factual current report on that, the initial factual report on the ATR, that there's horrible videos of it in a spin. There is the icing is undoubtedly the main factor in that very severe icing, and that report is out on the internet as well, and that's quite a horrifying read as to how quick the ice they think had built up on that aircraft as well. Jo, who was one of our other presenters as well, she loves icing. In the last webinar, she talked all about icing. So do get a replay on that if you want to learn about icing. There's I didn't know how many types of icing there is. I think it was 7, if I remember rightly. Jo will probably WhatsApp me and tell me I've got it wrong if not, but there you go. We're just going to do one more poll, which gives Simon a chance to have a quick drink before he does the next case study. So here we go. Have a go at this one. What approximate angle of bank should you select to fly a rate 1 turn at 100 knots? So 100 knots, typical GA aircraft speed. What kind of angle of bank should you be looking to select to get a rate 1 turn? This is related to the 180 turn on instruments that we just mentioned. So options 7 degrees, 10 degrees, 17, or 20 degrees. So let's have a look at the results, please, Talifer. What did we get? Got a bit of a spread, 10 degrees, 17 degrees. Now, again, there's no, definite right and wrong with these things as well. But the answer that we were actually kind of looking for was 17 degrees. The rule of thumb is your true airspeed divided by 10 plus 7. So you can approximate 100 over 10 equals 10 plus 7, 17. So there we go. That's a rough, but people saying 10, people saying 20, it's not a million miles away, but there you go, roughly 17. So that's a rule of thumb that you might want to learn for instrument flying. Simon, over to you for case study number 2.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Right, so here's another case. Again, many of you may be familiar with, but we've anonymized the incident as much as we can. Now, in this incident, there were many factors outside of the weather that were at play, but we're going to concentrate on the weather on the day in question and how that impacted what happened. So do bear that in mind when you're considering this. We are focusing in on the weather aspect of this case. Now, unfortunately, the pilot, who was not qualified to fly in cloud, found himself stuck above cloud, having been expecting to fly cross country under VFR rules. A chain of events ensued, which resulted in control of the aircraft being lost, and with both occupants of the aircraft tragically being killed after hitting a tree. So this is the route that the aircraft took. The aircraft had departed an airstrip in Somerset at 07:04 hours early in August, and the plan was to fly to the Isles of Scilly for the day, returning the same afternoon. Now, witnesses stated that at the time the aircraft took off, the weather was described by those witnesses as being of good visibility and with clear skies. Flying southwest towards Cornwall and passing to the north of Culdrose, this map and the graph shows the route and the timings that the aircraft took, and it's taken from the AIIB report. The aircraft began to descend around 1,000 feet over the sea before then turning right and heading east away from the Scilliars. It continued northeast, past north of Torquay, and then out over Lyme Bay. When it was over the sea, the aircraft descended further to be at 320 feet before completing 3 180-degree turns and 2 360-degree orbits. It then began to fly north from Lyme Regis towards the departure airstrip and climbed to 8,200 feet above mean sea level. At 0905 hours, the pilot called Dunkeswell radio and declared pan, 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 asking for the weather conditions at the airfield as he couldn't land at the departure airstrip because he was stuck above cloud. The weather at Dunkeswell was poor, with the cloud base on the deck and visibility of 400 meters. He was advised to call Exeter or the D&D unit. He complied with this request, and a further chapter to this evolving tragedy was added, but I'd advise you to read the AAIB for more detail on this. Now, the AAIB recovered a tablet device from the accident, as they were able to establish from that weather information was actually downloaded onto an app on the device the day before the incident. Outside of the app, weather data was viewed for the Isles of Scilly, Sidmouth, Bodmin and Exeter using the BBC weather website. There was a screenshot taken of the weather expected at Exeter from the BBC website at 0519 hours. It described the conditions as light cloud and a moderate breeze. The AAIB state this provided insufficient cloud information for aviation use. Now, our role tonight, as I said, is to concentrate on the weather at that time, and Darren has the details on that for you.
Right, thanks for that, Simon. So just like before, let's start by taking a look at the weather information that would have been available before this flight. And again, we'll see if there are any potential hazards to be aware of. Starting with the synoptic chart then. So this chart's valid at 0600, shows a large area of high pressure covering most of continental Europe. And that's, I guess, a fairly typical scene that we see in the summer months. Over the UK, an area of low pressure is centred to the west of Ireland, and that's influencing the weather over much of the country. Now, winds are light over southern England, as indicated by the lack of isobars on this chart. Of particular interest is the frontal zone lying along that southwest peninsula. Now, frontal zones, they mark the boundary between two air masses, and I know that from previous events, Simon has discussed these at length, so I won't go over them again in great detail here. But suffice to say, we can expect much more cloud in this area. Now, the frontal zone itself appears to be decaying in areas, and this is illustrated where the hatched lines are drawn along the front. That's a process known as frontolysis. That's a bit of a met term, but it basically means that the front is starting to lose some of its identity, usually due to rising air pressure. However, cloud and precipitation will remain, but it will become more fragmented over time. Okay, so now we'll take a look at some of the forecast information available before the flight, starting with the 215. Okay, now this is describing a particularly complex set of weather conditions across the UK. It was issued the previous evening, so it would have been available ahead of the flight. The image on the left is depicting several weather zones and the position of the slow-moving frontal area. The flight path is captured within Zone C of this chart. Zone C itself has been split into subzones. Now, this is done sometimes by forecasters when there are particular nuances within a zone that require articulating. So in this case, we're particularly interested in Zone C2, and I've highlighted the weather that is relevant to Zone C2 in yellow. The visibility in C2 was expected to be generally 15 kilometres, but occasionally reducing to 6 kilometres in areas of light rain or drizzle. Isolated areas of heavier rain and drizzle were expected to reduce further the visibility in places down to about 3,000 metres. And along windward coasts and upslopes, some mist was expected with associated visibility of just 2,000 metres. There's even an isolated chance of fog along windward coasts. In terms of the cloud ceiling of between 1,500 and 3,000 foot was expected, but occasionally the base was expected to lower to between 500 and 1,000 feet, and locally to as low as 200 feet. And along the windward coast and upslopes, there's a chance that the cloud may even lower to the surface. Now remember that heights given in the 215s are reference to sea level. So over elevated ground in the southwest, the actual cloud is likely to be significantly lower than those values. So to illustrate that, there's a reference to occasional hill fog indicating cloud at the surface. So let's take a look now at some of the TAFs. So I've selected these TAFs because they're the ones most relevant for the intended route along the flight. Given the time and when pre-flight briefing is likely to have occurred, not all aerodromes had yet opened and started to produce METARs. Now, without METARs, the Met Office is not permitted to issue TAFs. So this is one of the risks when planning a flight very early in the morning, before when many of the aerodromes are actually open. The key message from the available TAFs is the potential for some quite low cloud bases at aerodromes all across the southwest. For example, there was a Prop 30 of 600 foot forecast for Land's End, and similar and even lower cloud bases were forecast elsewhere. Remember that these were the first TAFs issued for the day, and most of these TAFs were not available actually at the time of departure. It's a fair question to ask, what would the TAFs have contained if earlier ones were issued? I guess we'll never know, but the indications from the 215 would give us a strong idea, I suspect. Now let's take a look at some of the available observation data. So close to the departure time, some airports were still closed, as I've mentioned. Those open were reporting variable amounts of cloud, low cloud, but generally good visibility. But if we now take a look at some of the observation data provided by these aerodromes later on at about 0920, we can start to see that there's evidence of areas of very low cloud reported by several aerodromes, notably Culdrose with the cloud reaching the surface, but also at plenty of the other ones. So these weather reports show a marked deterioration in the conditions as the morning progressed compared to those early morning reports. So I guess that's the weather for this one, and over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Darren. Now, it's important for me to emphasise here that analysing the ATC and the controller and the whole organisational actions and factors, as we've already alluded to, it's outside the time and the scope of this presentation. So I'm just focusing on the pilot and the weather decision making here. So what could have been some of the links in the chain in this accident case study? No recent instrument flying competence or qualifications. Very limited aircraft fit in this one, a bit like we discussed with some of the comments on the last one. Obtained the weather forecast before the relevant conditions became known. I think Darren's tried to give us some background on how that may have occurred during the morning. And the clear skies on departure reinforced that mental picture that everything was going to be okay. So there's a real human factors hook in there as well. They then encountered some poor weather. They climbed above solid cloud, but then they accepted some external assistance without questioning or informing. And ultimately, if you read the rest of the report, they attempted an instrument approach without relevant instruments or training. Now, it's not a criticism. It's just, like I say, a talk about what happened, which very sadly gave them a loss of control event as well. So you can see there's the chain of things building. You know, could we have broken the chain with one of those? Who knows? But perhaps again, something to think about when Simon does this next section. So again, over to you to talk about opportunities, Simon. Unmute, Simon.
There we are. Some people would say, what a relief that you can't hear him. Right, thanks, Matt. Let's have a look at what opportunities were missed that may have had an effect on the overall outcome in this case. So let's just run down them. What could we have done? Well, we could have delayed the flight to obtain the latest weather. We could have used mobile phone information for that, and that would have meant that we delayed the flight. We've looked at the latest weather information. As Darren says, you know, the Met Office don't issue TAFs until we've seen METARs, and that's a familiar thing with forecasters. We've got to know what conditions like out the window before we can issue the forecasts. The flights, the weather data obtained from the tablet suggests that the BBC weather website was consulted on the morning of the incident, and of course that's not sufficient for such a flight. That's not what the BBC weather website is there for. We've now got this access to a vast array of weather data, which is growing ever more every single day on the internet, so it's easy to get hold of the latest weather information. However, and I can't stress this enough, that must be from a recognised and reliable source. Yes, it's interesting a few days before to look at the apps on your phone, but many of you will know my feelings about weather apps. That amount of information can lull us into a false sense of security, and there's often a misconception that the sexiest sites are the most accurate. Let me tell you now that as a forecaster, and I know Darren will back me up on this, they are not the best sites. Okay, they are not the most accurate. Many of them just regurgitate the same data and they present it in a different way. That's all. Sometimes model runs can be different, they can be delayed, and that can lure you into a false sense of security of thinking that one outweighs the other. Always check the issue and the update times to make sure that the data is still relevant and that it's up to date. And as I say, just don't fall into that trap of thinking that the sexiest sites are going to be the most accurate. Think about your flight plan and routing, and always have in mind alternates when planning your flight. Look carefully at terrain heights, note them down so that when you're at maximum brain capacity in flight, you can make sound decisions based on pre-assessed information. Nominate and plan a diversion option and be ready to enact that diversion decision early on, as we said before. And have that diversion option in mind at all stages of the flight. Any flight, even in the most benign of weather conditions, can suddenly become critical if the weather deteriorates beyond your limits. And, you know, sometimes that can be on a clear, fine, sunny summer's day. You might get hit by a sea breeze front that rapidly develops. Showers can be there within minutes, and suddenly you're outside of your limits. So don't wait until it's too late to divert. Make the decision and then act on that decision. Be clear about state of emergency, competence and aircraft capabilities with external agencies, even under distress circumstances. Tell them what they need to know by better understanding you, your flight experience, your mental state and your aircraft capabilities. The relevant agencies can make a better assessment also as to how to help you. Don't assume they know all about you. Give them the information. Make sure they understand. Because remember, it's your life on the line. It's not theirs. Don't descend into cloud unless you're competent or able to carry out a planned recovery to visual conditions. Again, just plan what will happen if you can't get out of cloud again, and only enter cloud if you know what to do and you're competent in the procedure. Ask yourself if you know how to get back to visual conditions, and don't just assume you'll do it if you have to. And then think about the big picture. This is why it's so important that when you're looking at the forecast for a day, you're not just looking at your route, you're taking in that bigger picture. Were better flying conditions available in other reachable parts of the UK when you're stuck above cloud? Can you get somewhere? When you looked at that broad picture, where were the best conditions? And this is why sort of taking that big weather picture is so important. And again, why at weather school, we look at the whole weather situation before focusing down on your flight. Ask yourself if you know where that better weather actually is. In what direction? Do you have enough fuel to get there? I know there's lots to think about there, but trust me, that broader weather story is absolutely vital. There you go, Matt, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. That's the end of our case studies. There's some great questions and that coming in as well. We will try and answer some of them as well. I will just signpost now, though, we're not allowed as part of our contract to comment on individual commercial products and either recommending or not recommending. So when we talk about sources and things like that, will have to be generic rather than talking about specific sites or specific commercial companies. I'm sure you understand why that is. I think the only thing we can say is Simon, I'll let you and Darren correct me on this as well. It's all about the models that they're using to generate their information. So whatever site or whatever you're using, you need to understand where that data and modeling is coming from. I think that's something we can say. And the official aviation source in the UK for models and data is the Met Office. Correct me or agree with me, Simon, Darren, please.
Yeah, you're spot on there, Matt. And I think the important part of that is that, you know, I mean, even though I run a website that has model data on there, it is just model data. The Met Office is the only place that you're going to get human value added forecasts, which is why TAFs and 214, 215 are so important, and the gametes, because actually a human's looked at those, tweaked the models, and you know, myself and Darren spend all day looking at models. We just know how inaccurate they can be sometimes, and how we as forecasters need to tweak those. So absolutely, that's why it's so important that you get the official weather information.
Darren, anything to add from that, from a Met Office CA point of view at all? Or?
No, I think Simon's nailed it. I mean, the Met Office is the approved source of meteorological forecasts for aviation products and data on behalf of the CAA. So, yeah, a range of forecaster products and model data is available. But yeah, Simon mentions be aware of the limitations of just relying on model data. That you know, the model doesn't handle certain weather situations as good as other weather situations, but you don't need to know that, but the meteorologists do, and they know where to intervene and add value in the products that they create. So please do pay heed of the particularly the area forecasts like the 215 and the gametes, and the site-specific forecasts such as TAFs and aerodrome warnings.
And I'm just going
if you want to,
sorry, Matt.
Yeah, go on. You go.
Jump in again if you don't mind. Just adding on.
Please do. Yeah.
Just adding to what Darren said there. When I'm doing expert witness work, I'm often amazed how we can't prove what weather data a pilot looked at and took. So always, if you're looking at 214, 215, you're looking at the TAFs, just take a screenshot or take a print out of it. It's honestly, it'll make your life so much easier in the future, just to be able to prove that you looked at weather information. I'll just throw that in there. Really important.
And if you want a real life example of where models, some of you know I fly from RAF Benson a fair bit as well. It is well known and published that Benson is a frost hollow, and the models cannot cope with the temperature predictions or the lifting of fog at Benson. So the forecasters, the Met Office, military forecasters at Benson have to manually alter the model runs to cope with frost and fog lifting, because the models can't cope with the local frost hollow you know, geographical effects on it as well. So I know there's real life examples out there where the computer just can't cope with it, and the human goes in and fettles the clearances and the temperature drops and things like that. So yeah, there is some real life examples. Great questions. There was one more question I was going to pick up. There's a few people commented they were actually flying on the day of that case study as well, which was really interesting to get some of those actual examples there as well. Bartos has asked, what are the limitation of auto METARs? Do you cover that in the next bit, Darren, or do you want to answer that now?
I'll touch on that in the next bit, if that's okay.
We'll do that in the next bit. Brilliant.
Thanks.
Let's not forget that. Excellent. Right, let's move on then to talk about some threat and error management. And I think I'll go straight up and let you introduce it, as I think we've got another poll just to keep people awake.
Right, thanks. Okay then. So yeah, here's a poll. Here's a question. So when you see a cloud layer in a TAF described as being SCT, what is the most likely cloud cover, do you think? Is it less than a quarter coverage, between a quarter and a half coverage, over half coverage, or is it overcast? I'll mull over that one for a few moments. Less than a quarter, quarter to a half, more than half, or complete coverage? Okay, let's take a look at the answer then. The answer was B, yes, and 2/3 of you got that, which is an excellent result. So well done to everyone who got that. So cloud cover is split into what we call octas, or eighths of the sky. And scattered, or SCT, refers to between 3 to 4 octas or eighths cover. So even half cover can actually feel quite extensive when you're flying, especially when you're flying in and around cumulus cloud, when you can actually see the sides of the cloud. So don't take scattered cloud cover too lightly when you're planning flights. Okay. So now in this section, I'm going to provide you with some general guidance on understanding potential weather-related risks and how you can take some quite simple and common sense actions to help you to mitigate those risks. So let's start by picking out some of those weather risks and associated potential impacts when flying and the possible causes of these. So we put a few on the screen now. I'm sure there's several more that you can think of. Many of these risks can be anticipated and mitigated by effective weather planning and understanding your briefing products in order to help your weather decision making. So we're going to take you through some of those mitigations now. And we'll start with effective planning. So what do we mean by that? So effective planning is really predicated on getting the fullest possible picture of the weather for your departure and arrival airfields and all along the planned flight path. Now, a good strategy to employ is a kind of top-down approach to pre-flight weather briefing, and you start with the synoptic situation. So as we've seen earlier, synoptic charts, they do comprise a lot of lines and iconography, but a basic knowledge of what you're looking at can go a really long way to help you to understand the overall weather picture. I won't go into the fronts and air masses in detail right now, but what we'll do is we'll put a link into the chat so you can read more about fronts and air masses, maybe later on at your leisure. Now, to flesh out the synoptic situation, take a look at the area forecasts such as the 215s and the gamettes. These, as we've just said, these are written by trained meteorologists, and they have done the work of interpreting the synoptic situation for you, and they've created these semi-plain language forecasts. Now, you've probably all heard of 215s and gamettes, and they're quite similar in terms of their validity and the time of issue. But the main difference is that gamettes describe the weather within 4 fixed distinct regions, whereas the 215s comprise zones of similar weather, but they're not fixed by region. Irrespective, whichever you choose, these are fundamentals to understanding the likely weather along your route. So then next consider the specific information that's available to you, such as TAFs and METARs. Use these to understand the actual and forecast conditions for your departure and arrival aerodrome, but also all of those along your route in case you do need to divert. Other observation sources, such as weather radar, are a really easy way to visualize and track areas of precipitation and clouds, so it's worth paying heed to those as well. So there's plenty of products and data that's available to pre-brief on before you fly. And for example, you can obtain all that information from CA-approved sources such as the Met Office's Aviation Briefing Service. But use these to obtain the fullest possible picture of the weather and any threats before you decide whether or not to fly. After all, it's much better to understand the potential threats and decide risk mitigation strategies whilst you're in the planning phase, rather than reacting to unexpected weather in the midst of a flight when you're so preoccupied with many other things going on and when decision making could be actually compromised by workload pressures. So let's now consider some practical ways of using weather products to mitigate risk. So I'll put a few on screen now. We'll start with complexity. So the amount of information in products like the 215s can be overwhelming. After all, let's face it, there's a huge amount of weather that often goes on across the UK at any one time. And trying to convey that information succinctly in the 215 is often a real challenge. But a sensible practice is to break down that 215 by first understanding which zone, or maybe zones, you plan to operate in. Now, it may sound old school, but printing off a copy can be useful, so you can highlight the parts of the forecast that are relevant to the time of your flight, and that's something that Simon mentioned just now. Remember also that heights in area forecasts are referenced to mean sea level, so the actual cloud base is likely to be much closer to the ground. For example, a forecast cloud base of 1,500 foot in the 215 will be about 600 foot when you're flying around the area of Dunkers in Devon. In itself, this could be considered dangerously low, but the actual cloud, if it happens to turn out to be a little lower than this, well, avoiding that cloud is likely to bring you very close to the surface. So consider if any high ground and cloud would force you to reduce your altitude to a limit that you would find unacceptable. If there's anything you're unsure of in the forecast, for example, maybe you don't understand an abbreviation, or if there's an apparent inconsistency in the forecast, you're welcome to contact the Met Office to speak to one of the forecasters to seek clarification. Details are available within the Met section of the UK AIP, and we'll put details of that into the chat. So maybe make a note of the contact details on your phone if you ever need to call the Met Office to get that clarification. Now, in terms of anticipating risks, if you do need to turn back or divert, you'll want to turn into the direction of better weather. So study the forecast before flying to ensure you know the right choice to make if you do need to divert. Now, in the second case that we looked at, the poorest weather was in the southwest, but the weather close by to the north, such as at Gloucester Aerodrome, which was in Zone B of that 215 that we looked at, and that was forecast, the weather there was forecast to be considerably better. So it would have been a good strategy to consider ensuring you had sufficient fuel to navigate north to Gloucester in the event that conditions were deteriorating. The time of the flight is also well worth considering. Early flights mean that your arrival aerodrome may not yet be producing METARs, and as we highlighted before, without the METARs, you're unlikely to see a TAF. Now, this lack of data increases the threat of unintended consequences like inadvertent IMC. Do you need to be at your location by a specific time? Or could you plan better once the aerodromes along your route have opened and are started to produce METARs and have TAFs available for them? Also, often we find that the risk of hazards such as radiation fog, they reduce once the sun gets to work on warming the ground and mixing the air in the morning. So check the forecast for later on. Do they indicate a general improvement that would make it safer to fly? And then finally, think about the forecast uncertainty. So we know that forecasts provide information on cloud base and extent. Even if these forecasts do not indicate the likely presence of low cloud, that does not necessarily mean it cannot form, or it won't be lower or more extensive than its forecast. After all, as we all know, forecasts aren't always completely accurate, as much as some of us in the metals would like to think. If they were accurate, we could probably all go home and leave the models to it. So whilst forecasting remains an inexact science, it's important to build resilience and contingency into your planning, I think. If the conditions are forecast to be marginal to your limits, do you really want to take that chance, or is it best to delay a little? So the information in TAFs, they indicate the most likely values for the period of the forecast. But what's often overlooked is the fact that these values cover a range of potential values within which the TAF will not be amended. So to give an example of that, if you see 3,000 meters visibility in a TAF, it means that the actual visibility may be between 1,500 meters and 5,000 meters without the TAF having to be amended. So a TAF will only be amended if the observed conditions fall outside of these values. Okay, so that's quite a complex thing to get your head around sometimes, but if you want to learn more about that, we'll pop a link into the chat about that. So don't rely on TAFs alone. They are site-specific forecasts, and a lot of weather can happen between two TAFs. So use the area forecast in conjunction with the TAFs to get the full picture. And whatever you do, don't try to interpolate the forecast conditions between two TAFs. So finally, we're going to mention a few points about METARs. So METARs are great, but they're out of date as soon as they're issued. If the METARs are validating threats that are shown in the forecast, that's a strong signal to reconsider your plans. Once in flight, it's a good idea to seek weather updates for your destination and diversion airfields. And remember, METARs are not typically produced outside of airport operating hours, so there'll be fewer METARs overnight and early in the morning. Now, somebody mentioned about auto METARs. Some airports do issue auto METARs outside of their normal operating hours, and they're permitted to do so under CA regulations. But treat these with caution, because the instruments that the data for the auto METARs is derived from that measure the cloud base and visibility, well, they carry inherent limitations when there's no trained Met observer to validate the output. After all, a celiometer, the instrument that measures cloud, is only looking at one point directly above its sensor rather than around the whole airfield. So there's a raft of resources available from several sources, both on making best use of briefing products and also practical advice on weather threat and error management principles. So we're putting those on screen now.
Brilliant, thanks.
And yeah, so I think that's, yeah, there they are. Good. So that's about all I've got for this section. So yeah, I'll hand over back to you now, Matt.
Brilliant, thanks Darren. Lot to digest in that bit as well. I was pretty stunned, I have to say, perhaps giving something away as an examiner, but hey, 3,000 meter visibility in a TAF could be between 1,500 and 4,000. That was new to me. So there we go. All learned something.
It's a shocker, isn't it?
It is. Yeah,
Darren, isn't it the same thing with cloud bases as well, isn't it? That you've got there's a broad range that a cloud base actually applies to.
Exactly the same for cloud, yeah, and for that matter, wind as well.
Yeah, it's something to really be aware of. That is that, in a way, Darren, would I be right in saying that TAFs are really they're guides, aren't they? That's the way to view it, is as a guide, not as an absolute, because it is just that, it's a forecast.
Yeah, it is a forecast, and like any forecast, forecasts can and do go wrong. Now, when they do fall out, if they do become wrong beyond a certain amount, then the meteorologist is obliged to bring them back in by amending the TAF. So they're never going to be wildly inaccurate, but certainly there's a degree of variability that can exist within a TAF without it having to be amended, that's for sure.
So I'm going to do an unscripted bit here because I'm interested now. You've piqued my interest, gentlemen. So if there's, I don't know, scattered 020 2,000 feet for a cloud in a TAF, then What's the range that could be then? Any ideas?
Right, you've got me there.
Over to you, Darren.
Yeah. Okay. So I believe that you can have a range of, you can have cloud within the band of 2,000 foot to 5,000 foot without
Yeah.
it being amended. So
Yeah.
so 3,000 foot cloud base, maybe that's good so long as the actual cloud base remains between 2,000 foot and 5,000 foot. The TAF will be good and won't be amended. But if it drops, the cloud base drops to less than 2,000 feet, and there's no mention of that in the TAF, then the meteorologists have got a job to do to bring that TAF back into line.
But that's fascinating, isn't it? So 3,000 feet, you could think that's a cracking day, that is, but it could actually be down at 2,000. And then with what you've talked about, with potential higher ground and that as well, that could actually be quite a challenging situation. So that's interesting, isn't it? There we go.
I think what it does, Matt, it kind of makes us always aware that, and this is one of the problems again. I know I'm banging on about apps, but you put your postcode in and it gives you a forecast. There's the temperature, there's the wind speed, there's the visibility, and it kind of, from a human factors perspective, it lulls us into a false sense of security that that's the level of accuracy that we should expect, and we should get that from TAFs and from 215. But the reality is that as forecasters, we can't deliver that level of accuracy, and neither can the model. It's just that the models lull us into this full sense of security. What forecasters are doing is actually far more accurate than what the apps are doing, and that's why it's so important that you can forecast yourself. You learn how to sort of do some forecasting yourself, and then you can kind of understand what the forecaster, what the human is trying to do and trying to predict through the products. I'm on my soapbox now.
And yet what I always think about it is, and what I teach my students, and that is big to small. So when you're assessing the weather, as Darren showed in his flow diagram there, go from big to small. So start off with a big picture of the day and then hone it down to your particular airfield and your flight. That's what I recommend you do. There's some great resources there. There's loads we've put in the chat box as well. Don't worry about missing those, or if you're not seeing them on the replay, they'll be on the website, they'll be on the post email as well, and on our resource section as well. So you will be able to pick them up as well. There's one other amazing resource I have to highlight. This is Simon's weather school. And Simon, this is going to be online over the winter. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is going to be, actually, my weather schools running up to this are completely full. So this is the last one of 2024. Can you believe it, at the end of the year? So yeah, this is going to be an online course that runs over the consecutive Tuesday evenings of the 26th of November and the 3rd of December, as it says there, between 6:30 and 9 p.m. Each session is actually recorded, so if you can't make each session, that's absolutely fine. You can watch it as a catch up afterwards. But yeah, we're taking bookings now. So if you want to come along, go to weatherschool.co.uk. And all the info is on there. But the idea is to get you fly more and fly more safely. That's what weather schools are all about.
Brilliant. And Josh has obviously earned his £10 that you've given him there, Simon, because he's saying it's amazing. So yeah, well done.
Josh, I told you not to make it so obvious.
Brilliant. Now I'll also say as well, if that's your learning style, or my teenager and children, they learn everything by watching videos and shorts and all the rest of it. Very different learning style to when I perhaps learned and did textbooks and that. There's lots of good videos on Simon's one as well, if that works for you as a learning style as well, about some of these things as well. So that's definitely worthwhile. We've taken some Q&A as we've gone along, but we have got a few more. So I'm going to ask these. I'm going to ask this one. I know, Simon, I think this is somebody else Simon has given a £10 note to. Usefulness of skew T plots. I think this is another of your pants, Simon, isn't it?
Yeah, my mum's been busy this evening, hasn't she? Yeah, I mean, again, that I bang on about this all the time, that I think skew Ts are, and tephigrams is what we know them as in the UK, and in the Met Office they're tephigrams. because we're more refined, aren't we? So we see tephigrams, but SKUTs are what they're known at kind of worldwide. And SKUTs are effectively height versus temperature diagrams that meteorologists use all the time to predict things like cloud bases, tops, whether it's going to be showers, rain, whether there's going to be mist or fog, and winds at various different levels. And for me, I think SKUTs are one of the hidden treasures of forecasting for flying, because you can get them for kind of any airfield. You need training in them, you need shown how to use them, but Darren knows that we as forecasters use them every day. And I would say to you, look, if you can learn how to use SKUTs, do spend a bit of time, get into them, learn them, because they'll help you build your confidence as well, in being able to use the weather. And that's what a lot of this is about, you know. So this is why I always say as well, even if you're not flying, go and download 215, download an analysis chart or a forecast chart, and then look out the window, compare that to what those charts are saying, because that builds a picture in your mind as to what's actually happening weather-wise, without you having the pressure of planning a flight. You know, the time to learn weather is when the weather's really, I was going to say a rude word then, but really pants outside the window. That's when to learn weather, and kind of that's when to learn SKUTs as well. This is the perfect time through the winter. But yeah, that's how to do it. SKUTs, yep, definitely go and do a search for it, learn them.
And where do you get hold of them? Somebody's asked.
So there are many websites. I use weatheronline.co.uk. I'll put a link to their SKUTs. I've got them on my website as well. And I'll send a link over that we can send out. And these are forecast SKUTs. Go and have a look at them. I'm going to mention I have a course at Weather School on them, but that's not the reason I'm saying that. Go and have a look, do a search, and yeah, and you'll find them. They really are an excellent hidden resource. Take a bit of work, but once you're into them, yeah, you won't forget that skill.
Great. We've had a few questions as well. Perhaps Darren and Simon can both pick this up. Just remind us which forecast or Met reports are AMSL and which are AGL. Just remind us on that, because we've had a few questions and discussions around that.
Well, the way to think of it is area-based forecasts are all referenced to mean sea level, whereas site-specific forecasts are all referenced to ground level. So, for example, a 215 and a gamut will have heights reference to sea level because they're area forecasts, but a TAF will have its heights relevant reference to ground level. So, for example, a TAF for Exeter or TAF for Farnborough, or those cloud bases will be referenced to the height above the ground at Farnborough Airport. Hope that helps.
Brilliant. That is amazing. That is just the most simple way I've heard that explained in years, Darren. That's brilliant. So if it's over a big area forecast, it's AMSL. If it's for a specific site, it's AGL. Dead easy. Brilliant. Love it. Yeah, that's a really good takeaway. And Chris has asked, are TAFs still issued every 6 hours every day? I think different airfields issue different length TAFs, don't they? Some, like Heathrow, does a very long TAF. Some sites are just in their operating hours, and that, so it varies, doesn't it? I think.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the CAA in the UK, the CAA determined the length of the TAF that is to be provided for any particular aerodrome. So the Met Office produces TAFs for 55 aerodromes across the UK, and for the airports that serve traffic that comes from the furthest away, such as Heathrow, they get the longest TAFs, because obviously if you're flying from Australia to Heathrow, that's a long time, and you need a TAF that's going to be valid for when you intend to arrive at Heathrow. So that's why they get a 30-hour TAF. But for other airports that maybe just serve domestic air traffic, they will only get a TAF valid for 9 hours. So 9-hour TAFs are issued routinely every 3 hours, but longer TAFs, such as 24 or 30-hour TAFs, they're issued routinely every 6 hours.
Brilliant, thanks, Dan. There's a few questions as well about climbing and descending and the options relating to those as well. What we're talking about with that is and I'll let Simon add to this as well. We're talking about route study versus the weather. So, for example, if you've got a low cloud-based forecast, um, or a cloud base where you're planning to go overhead something, and that's kind of relative to the airspace that's around there as well. You might be boxing yourselves in with options. So, for example, if you're it may be that if you plan a slightly longer route, you've got the ability to climb over some low cloud because you've routed clear of some airspace above you. Whereas, you could have a situation, you're planned to go underneath some fairly low airspace. You also encounter some very low cloud there, but but it's kind of scattered, a thin layer. Sometimes you get those days where you get a thinnish layer. Well, it might be, and it can be totally within VFR privileges to climb above a scattered layer. But if the route you've selected has airspace above you, it might force you to be operating in and out of that scattered layer and give you problems. That's just kind of one example. So I think that's what we were talking about there, Simon. And hopefully I've explained it kind of okay.
Yeah, I think you have, Matt. And I think as well, an appreciation of what Darren said about the margins of error in the TAFs. Think around that as well when you're thinking about those climb descent options. Think about those sort of changing cloud bases that perhaps won't be mentioned in the TAF. I think it's thinking broader again, isn't it? That's what it's all about. It's just thinking beyond. I'm flying at that level. That's where I'm going to be. It's knowing that those movements are there, and how do I get out of that problem? And again, just thinking all the time, those TAFs have got those margins of error to consider. I say margins of error, they're not margins of error, they're bands that they can forecast within. But yeah, you've got it right, Matt. You've got it right.
And somebody's mentioned the SKUTs about locations, and that I think the locations are relative to where they do radio sonding. Is that right?
Not really, not
No,
with
no.
SKUTs. Yeah, with actuals. So with radio sondes where we're launching a balloon and there's a little package of instruments on the bottom. So that's the actuals. But when I'm talking about SKUTs, generally I'm thinking forecast SKUTs, and essentially you can get those for any location.
Okay, brilliant.
Sort of 8 days ahead.
Somebody's mentioned volmets as well. Is there a way to get volmets other than radio? Does anybody know on that one, Darren?
I'm not entirely sure whether volmets. I think the volmet broadcast is not available via phone, but what I do know is that several airports do publish their ATIS over telephone numbers. So they're published, I think, in the AIP, in the aerodrome section of the AIP. So I'm not entirely sure about the volmet, but I do know for a fact that ATIS broadcasts are available by phone from selected airfields, if that's help.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've had some comments as well about the Met Office app and that on my phone, which is great for starting off with that big hand picture. But I think what we're saying about the Met Office app is, yeah, it's based on the Met Office model runs, but I don't know the mechanics behind it, but perhaps Darren could comment. I think the Met Office app simplifies a lot of the data, doesn't it, in terms of cloud and things like that? Because I know often it will show a kind of, a white cloud, which is kind of like okay cloud coverage, but actually that's very simplified in terms of the bands, for example. So
yeah, it's basically an interpolation of the basic raw model data that's presented to try and make it a little bit more intuitive, a little bit more digestible for pilots, basically. But like we've been saying, model data is great for a bit of situational awareness, but do be aware that don't try and brief using model data in isolation. Use it as part of a holistic briefings regime.
Okay, yeah, brilliant.
Can I just jump in there, Matt, as well?
Please do, Simon. Yeah.
The word there is that uses. Does that mean the Met app, which I assume is the Met Office app, is inaccurate? I think it's important to say it's not inaccurate, as Darren said. It's interpreting the model data that comes out, and it's not necessarily intended for pilots. There is that pilot section, the aviation section, which is where you should be kind of going to for that. I always think apps are great if you want to know about hanging out your washing, but beyond that, it's starting to get a bit iffy. We need to get into more specialist forecasts. I'm sure me and Darren could talk about that over a pint for however long, but that's always my view on the apps. If you want to hang out your washing, apps are fantastic, but otherwise get into the more specialist stuff.
Brilliant. Yeah. And the final comment, really, and I'll let Simon and Darren comment before we wrap up. There has been some comment and discussion about, actions and things to do in that. What I would always say is, as the pilot in command, as I think we've tried to emphasize as well, do what you need to do in terms of, aviate, navigate, communicate, don't, do what you need to do to get to or maintain safe weather, and then do the navigation and the communication bits afterwards. If you need to declare an emergency, do so. If you need to get hold of air traffic agencies, do so as well. I had a situation on an instrument approach not long ago at an airfield. We became visual out of a fairly low cloud base. We were going to do the missed approach for further training. I could see a particularly horrible unforecast weather cell ahead of us on the climb out. And I downloaded the METARs after the event, actually, and it was really very much an unforecast, horrible weather cell that really burst and kicked off. So we broke off visually from the instrument approach, turned right against the circuit pattern, and went off to some clearer air. And then I told air traffic, "This is what I'm doing for weather avoidance," and that as well. So, that was us controlling the situation, and then kind of appropriately negotiating with air traffic to what we were doing as well. But if we'd have just blindly followed and waited to do the RT communication, we could have flown into a pretty horrible cell that had just kicked off. Other aircraft then started appearing on the radio saying they were diverting around and things like that as well. So aviate, navigate, communicate, old adage, but so very true. Darren or Simon, any final last words on that?
I think what I would just jump in and say, Matt, is that, I've got way less experience than you. And, I can fly on a day that I think is going to be really good conditions and actually get caught out as well. So it happens to all of us. But yeah, I think the best thing to do is just to, as I say, when the weather's poor outside, get some weather learning in, do some reading around the subject, go and have a look at the free resources that are out there, and make the absolute most of them. And probably I'd close by saying, I think the most important thing to remember is that the forecast never goes wrong. The forecast is always 100% as far as the forecaster is concerned. It's the weather that goes wrong.
Darren, can you beat that as a final word? On mute, Darren. Yeah, just.
So yeah, I almost got to the end without doing that, didn't I? No, I can't live with, with that comment. Look, I mean, I would say just take time out to properly brief and recognize that the weather can and does go wrong. It doesn't always behave as forecast. Account for that in your planning. Make sure you got some mitigations and some resilience in your plan to adapt for if and when the forecast does go wrong, because one day it will, and you'll be flying, I guess, and you'll want to plan to extricate yourself from that situation. So make sure you've got a good plan.
Brilliant, thanks, Darren. And that plays to a question that's last minute popped in as well about people being risk averse and not flying as well. I think if you've got those plan Bs, you've got those mitigation strategies, that gives you the confidence and the ability to fly in perhaps more challenging conditions or more those challenging days as well. So I think that's all part of being able to do that as well. There's some takeaways there. We've covered those as well. You can stop and have a read of that on the replay if you want to at some stage. Thanks for coming. We hope you've been able to take something away from this evening. And as a reminder, like I say, you'll get a replay of the workshop via email with a lot of the resources. Once we finish tonight as well, a survey will pop up in your window. Please take the time to fill this in. Genuinely, to use the cliche, your feedback is valuable to us because it allows us to hone these workshops for what you want to get out of them in the future, and we negotiate with the CAA on that as well in terms of themes and issues, so we get that from the feedback. It's really helpful to us as well. There's going to be some human factors coming up in November. Keep an eye on our website and social media channels for that as well, but sadly we've run out of time this evening. All that remains is me to say a big thank you to Simon and Darren. Absolutely excellent subject matter as ever. Talifer has been great behind the scenes, keeping the tech, which has gone pretty well tonight. So thank you very much as well. We really thank you for all your engagement. It makes it really does. If you see us around airfields, do come and chat to us. Do come and say hello. I often bump into people, and it's lovely to chat and reflect on people as well. And the final thought for me as well, in my experience as well, it's always the Met officers that have got the best biscuits and chocolates on any flying station as well. So it's really worth going and getting to know the Met team as well and engaging with them. Yeah, if that reason, nothing else. Simon, Darren, thanks again. Talifer, thanks everybody for joining us, and fly safely and take care. We'll look to see you around, hopefully. Take care. Thank you.
Soon. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.